So now that we finally installed the Firebase SDK and got everything set up there, we can go back to our auth screen and there to the submit method to finally create a new user with help of Firebase. Of course, we'll also soon add logic to log users in, but before we can log users in, we need users, and that's why we'll start with sign up and with creating users. Now, of course, for that here, in the submit method, we have to find out in which mode we are, if we are in login mode or in sign up mode. And therefore here, I'll actually adjust this logic and check if the input was not valid, in which case I'll just return like this so that no other code thereafter gets executed, so that I can get this code here out of the if statement. This is not required, but make sure that the code stays readable and I'm not adding too many levels of nested if statements, which can make the code a bit harder to read. Because I'm now going to add another if statement here after saving this. I'll check if is login is true. So if we are in login mode. And in that case, we'll add the logic to log users in. Now we can't do that yet because we have no users yet, therefore I'll start with the else branch instead, which is that we're in sign up mode, and here I want to use Firebase now to create new users. Now for that we can use this Firebase auth package that we installed. We can import package and then there Firebase auth, and from there Firebase auth.dart. Then here in this file, we can add a new global variable, a final variable here in my case, which I'll name underscore Firebase. And in that variable, I'll store a value that will be created with help of the Firebase auth class, and then there the instance property. This in the end gives us access to a Firebase object that will be created and managed behind the scenes by the Firebase SDK. And I'm setting this up once here outside of all my classes because I can then use that same Firebase object over and over again in my entire code. And I can, for example, use it in the submit method in this else branch here, if we are in sign up mode, to then call various methods provided by Firebase. For example, the create user with email and password method here. This will do what the name suggests. It will create a new Firebase user with email and password. Now, for this method to succeed, you must make sure that in your Firebase project, which you connected to your Flutter project through the Flutter Fire CLI, you got authentication enabled, and specifically you got that email password authentication enabled, as I did here a couple of lectures ago. With that enabled, you can call this method here in your code. And now I want to pass my entered email and my entered password here to Firebase with that method. Now, create user with email and password will return a future, which then in the end will resolve to a user credential value. It may also throw an exception, as you learn here, if you, for example, already have a user with that email address, or if the email address should be invalid, or for example, if the password should be too weak, too short, for example. So therefore, because it may throw such an exception and because it regularly returns a future, I want to add async here to handle that future thing and store my user credentials in a variable called user credentials after awaiting create user with email and password. But since, as mentioned, this could fail, we also want to wrap this with try catch. And you learned about that earlier in the course as well. Here we can use try catch to try some code and then catch an exception, an error. And here we can now use a slight variation of try catch and add another extra keyword, the on keyword, which in the end just allows us to define the type this error will be of. And here we learn that in the end it will be an error of type Firebase auth exception, which in the end is just a more specific version or a specific kind of exception. And therefore here we can add Firebase auth exception as the type that will be assumed for this error object. And in this catch block here, we could then check if error code is equal to, and we learn about the available codes here. So for example, if it's equal to email already in use, we could then show an appropriate error message on the screen. Now here I'll not do this error code specific handling. Instead, I'll just in general use the scaffold messenger here of context to clear any existing snack bars and then show a new snack bar thereafter with show snack bar, just as we did it earlier in the course, to then here create a snack bar object where my content in the end will be a text widget, and the text I want to show will be my error message. Now this might be null, and therefore here I'll add this double question mark operator so that if this should be null, I show some fallback message, which could be authentication failed. So with that, we also have at least some basic error handling here, and we're also getting those user credentials if authentication succeeds, or if the user creation succeeds, to be precise. And I'll therefore then print those user credentials here so that we can take a look at them in the debug console and see what's inside that user credentials object. But that's how we could now use the Firebase SDK for sending such a user creation request. Now what's really important to keep in mind is that you could do this all manually, as you learned it in the HTTP section, but here we're using the SDK to simplify certain things, like for example this error handling. The SDK will ensure that such an error will be thrown, which we can then handle in a quite convenient way, as you see here. But as mentioned before as well, of course we're also using the Firebase SDK because it will later help us with image upload and so on. With all that out of the way though, if you save this all and you ensure that the submit method is connected to your elevated button, and you then reload your app, you should be able to enter an email address here and also a password, and then click on create an account. That's important because you must be in sign up mode, because we right now only added the sign up logic. And if you then click on sign up, nothing happens here, of course, though that at least proves that we don't seem to have an error. Otherwise, we should be seeing such a snack bar here. But since we don't see that, it looks like everything worked. And if we now go to the debug console, indeed in there, you should see such a user credential thing. A quite complex object which contains a bunch of information about the user that was just created. In addition, if you go back to your Firebase project, you should also be able to go to the authentication section and then click on users, and there you should see that one user that you did just create. And that of course proves that the user creation works. Now if I try to create exactly the same user again with the same email address, I instead get that snack bar with that convenient error message, which is created by the Firebase Auth SDK. And that of course therefore then of course also shows us that this basic error handling seems to work. And with that we can now move on to logging users in.